Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. Nice to be back with you all. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to be back with you and our viewers.
Yeah, likewise. Well, I thought we would talk about President-elect Trump and his cabinet picks, because we're kind of getting a sense of what direction he's heading in here. And so why don't you take the ball first and run with it, and then I'll respond to whatever you say.
Well, first of all, it's turning out to be a little different than I think some of his supporters hoped for, and surprising perhaps to some of his critics. The bottom line is that if we look down some of the cabinet positions, let's take the Department of Education, and he has nominated Betsy DeVos. She's a very prominent advocate of school choice and charter schools in Michigan. She actually is part of the DeVos family of the Amway company originally, and I'm sure that she's very sincere and devoted to believing that the current government educational system is failing and in its promise to educate and prepare young people for their lives when they reach a certain age. But the fact is that while she talks about school freedom and school choice, the fact is that as much as some people may say that the charter system and the voucher system might be an improvement over just the monopoly government school system, given a certain degree of choice and flexibility. The fact is that it remains a form of government-funded, government-sponsored, and government-influenced education, where the money comes from, the curriculum standards that must be met, the certification of teachers, so that, in fact, rather than being an answer to the failing governmental school system in terms of both learning and content, I fear that in spite of the attempt to sort of free the school system, this will solidify and legitimize the government's hand in education, but in the form of supposedly school choice. Now, if we look at another pick,
hang on a second, Richard. Let me weigh in on each one of these as you talk about them. And
sure.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. You know about this. Educational matter. I mean, it really draws the line between conservatives and libertarians. I mean, the libertarian position is, look, let's have a separation of education in the state, a total free market in education. And our principle is liberty, that this is education, like religion, is a matter for the family.
Let me play among the stars.
We'll have a little Frank Sinatra in here, Richard. Nice.
Sorry.
No problem. Okay, so we call for a separation of church and state and education in the state. Conservatives, they love the state involved in education. They just want it in their way, like with school vouchers. It's just a welfare plan for the middle class, or it's their concept, the conservative concept of central planning and education, that we're going to have charter schools that are going to be run by our kind of people. We're going to have vouchers that are really government welfare to take people out of the public schools and put them into private schools. I have written time and time again that this does not lead to educational freedom. It's not a gradual way to freedom, as Milton Friedman said. It actually entrenches the state even more because it makes private schools dependent on this welfare. They build buildings, they expand staff, they hire new teachers. They do all these things in anticipation that their voucher funds are going to continue. And so it's really an expansion of the state in education. Remember that conservatives, Republicans used to call for an abolition of the Department of Education. And now we see once again that they're really just central planners. They want to centrally plan education just like liberals do, but in a different way.
Well, I think we also have to put it in a slightly wider context about the correct points that you've just made. And that is there is an underlying presumption or premise, whether it be on modern liberals, progressives, or on the conservative side. And that is, it is the duty and responsibility of some level of government, state, local, now increasingly with the Department of Education, federal, but that is the duty and the responsibility of government to provide schooling for young people and to mandate and control, supervise, and direct the content of that education. It is the notion that it is the duty of the government to, in a sense, mold young citizens into the form that will serve the interests of the nation. It is worth recalling that this was, in fact, the origin of bringing compulsory schooling to the United States, which did not exist far into much of the 19th century. It was based on following sort of a Prussian model that the purpose of education is to mold the subjects and the citizens to a form of character and service and loyalty that will serve the political authority. Now, the content of our education has changed many times over the year. The way I sometimes like to explain it, Jacob, is that when I was in school, and you learned about Christopher Columbus, he was this great European who believed the world was round, and he sailed across the Atlantic thinking he was going to approach India, and instead he bumped into some islands in the Caribbean. And he opened, therefore, a new world and a new set of continents to development, growth, civilization, industrialization. And in the history books, you'd see happily industrial facilities with smokestacks, all the result of the grand and creative and exploring endeavors of Christopher Columbus. That was the party line. America is great. Christopher Columbus is a hero. Industrialism is the basis of our prosperity and our liberty. Then there's the new progressive party line that the little kids in a monopoly fashion learn in virtually all the schools across the country. Christopher Columbus was this insensitive and uncaring European who wanted merely to plunder the wealth of other peoples and brought all these diseases and maladies upon the Indians, and then filled this continent, having stolen everything from the innocent Indians and plundered the land and polluted the soils and the air, and all because of Christopher Columbus. The world is going to end. Now, that's the two-party lines, with admittedly some exaggeration, but those are the two-party lines. But what's important here, the idea is that regardless of the content, there is to be a template, particularly in citizenship, history, current event studies, and then literature and English and all the other things, of a party line that sort of molds young people to believe certain things about themselves, their country, and their place in the society, all guided by a political agenda. Who's in charge of it and the content of it has changed over the years, but the idea is the purpose of the government to mold the citizens to be good, obedient subjects.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's really the purpose everywhere, to create the good little citizen. And a remarkable example of this is that kid. Remember that kid, Leon Gonzalez, whose father was in Cuba, and the federal government grabbed him and transported him back to Cuba so he could be with his father. And really, it was a fight over which system was going to be indoctrinating this kid. Because if he had been here, he would have been in public schools, and instead he ended up in Cuba under Cuba's public schools. Well, it made all the difference in the world. If he had been here, he would have taken the position when he reached 18 years of age and into adulthood that the standard American public school graduate believes in, that it was okay for the CIA to go out and try to murder Fidel Castro because he was a communist, and it's okay to kill communists. But he ends up in Cuba, and I read an article the other day that he just greatly laments that Fidel Castro's passed away. Castro was heroic, that he was a champion of Cuba. And I mean, it all depends on which system is doing the molding and indoctrinating. And I was part of the victimization of this process. I mean, I grew up in public schools, going to public schools, and I became a believer in the welfare state way of life. I believed that government had a legitimate role to help the poor. I mean, it never occurred to me that government got its money by taking it from some people and giving it to others. The warfare state, I believed in this tripe about going to Vietnam and fighting the communists and saving America. But fortunately, I broke through this indoctrination. And that really, I think, is what distinguishes a lot of libertarians from other people who have been subjected to this thing, is that we've been able to achieve the breakthrough that enables us to see what a genuine free society is all about. And your point about the state role in this is absolutely right on. And I think it's important to note that we're talking about different levels of government here. You've got the federal government with the Department of Education. You could abolish that because there's certainly nothing in the Constitution that entitles the federal government to be involved in state educational matters. But from a local standpoint and a state standpoint, you don't need public schooling. You don't need a state Department of Education. All you need is freedom, educational liberty. And as you point out, getting rid of the compulsory attendance laws, the school taxes, just separate school and state.
Yes, exactly. If all you need to do is to end the restrictions, eliminate mandatory attendance laws, basically allow individuals to follow their own choices with ending mandatory taxing for these schools, and to allow the market to do this. How could people say, but how could this happen? It's very simple. You give these government schools to the teachers and the administrators. It's your private property now. Or you sell them off as assets to companies that might want to undertake private education, either as a standalone private school or a consortium of a corporation with various schools in an area or around the country, like any other business. All of that would be the means to do this, to quickly denationalize and depoliticize education. But of course, this is only one element of what unfortunately will be a disappointing and frustrating 4 years of the Trump administration. He campaigned on the stump constantly by saying it is time to end Obamacare, that his first priority would be the end of the Affordable Care Act, that it has been a disaster, it's raised premiums, it has narrowed people's choices concerning their doctors and treatment, etc., and that his first priority would be to end Obamacare. Now what do we see, now that he's the president-elect, not even the president yet, the president-elect? He has backstepped. Well, it's good, and we probably need to keep on the books this mandatory ability of parents to keep their kids on their medical insurance policies until they're at least 26 years old. It's desirable to keep as a mandate that insurance companies cannot discriminate or to demand higher premiums from those who have preconditions. And now his nominee for health and human resources has emphasized that we have to ease out of this, and we have to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, and so that to have still a form of government oversight of medical care, but give people a little bit more freedom, a little bit more choice, but it is still in the straitjacket of government control. The fact is, again, to repeat something that you said yourself about the education, there's obviously nothing in the Constitution that gives the government, the federal government, the authority, responsibility, or the obligation to be involved in medical insurance or health care of the American people. Traditionally, the Founding Fathers would have considered that the responsibility of individuals, families, and the voluntary associations of communities. But the fact is that beginning under Franklin Roosevelt, accelerating under Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and now with this massive infusion of even more government control with Barack Obama's Affordable Care Act, government dominates the medical industry. It is not a free market in medical care. And when people point to, well, what about availability? What about cost? What about the respect and dignity and choices for the patient? There's none of this. It is not due to the free market. It's due to the cumulative growth of government regulation, control, dictate, and command over healthcare pricing, healthcare availability, and healthcare services and insuring. What is needed is, in fact, to abolish Obamacare, absolutely, but also the abolition of Medicare and Medicaid. and all other related programs that have put the federal government in charge of health care and medical services in the United States. You want affordable health care? You want availability and competitive choice? You want a market that is constantly improving the quality while competitively creating incentives to control and even diminish the costs of their provision? Then you get government out of health care and medical insurance and allow the market to openly, freely, and unrestrictedly work. And just as we have taken it for granted that our smartphones get better and cheaper every year, that our flat screen TVs get thinner with more pixels every year at a lower cost of buying them at retail stores, the same would occur with medical care and health insurance if the government would just get out of the way. But that is clearly not as what is going to happen under the careful and supposedly businesslike eye of Donald Trump.
Yeah, well said. I think he's nominated this guy, Georgia Representative Tom Price, who has been critical of Obamacare, which a lot of Republicans, I mean, that's sort of their signature position for the last 4 years, Obamacare, and that's how they do their fundraising drives in the conservative think tanks and the foundations. And I've said the whole time that this is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. And so I think you're absolutely right. There's not a chance that they're going to repeal Obamacare, despite the fact that they control both houses of Congress now. They control the presidency. Yes. They're going to back off like they always back off. These are just fundraising tools and things to get people riled up. Because as I have said throughout this whole thing, when I read all these conservative diatribes about Obamacare, is that if you repeal Obamacare, you still have a health care crisis. I mean, why was Obamacare enacted in the first place? Because there was a severe health care crisis. So if you get rid of Obamacare, you still have a health care crisis, and then what are you going to do about it? And that's when people start saying, they're already challenging Trump. Well, what would you replace it with? What would you replace it with? And this is what the conservatives and the Republicans would never answer whenever they would attack Obamacare. And when I spoke at various conservative groups, I would point this out, that this is just reform. You're not getting to the root of the problem. And what you have just pointed out is the root of the problem. Medicare, Medicaid, occupational licensure, the regulations. I mean, in order to resolve the health care crisis, you have to pull the weed out by its root. You have to get rid of Medicare. You have to get rid of Medicaid. You have to get rid of all government intervention. It's essentially the same thing as in education and religion, a separation of health care in the state. Now, people can say, oh, that's pie in the sky. It's not realistic. It's the only practical thing. Because it's the only thing that works, Richard. I mean, what could be more practical than to advocate the only thing that works, and that's freedom and the free market. We once had the best healthcare system in the world in history. In the 1950s, where there was very minimal government intervention before Medicare and Medicaid, people could buy their medical services. It was just a standard kind of cost of living. I think people had catastrophic medical policies, but nobody had just regular medical policies. You just went to the doctor like you went to the grocery store. Everything was done cheaply, efficiently. There were doctor's calls at homes. I grew up in Laredo, as you know, Laredo, Texas, which the Census Bureau said was the poorest city in the United States. Every day, doctors' offices were filled, many times with people from Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. And I've never heard of one instance where any doctor in Laredo turned down anyone for non-payment or who couldn't pay. They subsidized the poor by giving them free medical services because they were making so much money from the wealthy and the middle class. This is what we need to restore, but the only way to restore it is to pull that weed out by its root, and that's what we libertarians do. We just keep raising people's vision because at some point, Richard, people are going to stop banging their heads up against the wall and say, you guys are right. There's nothing that can be done to fix this interventionist socialist system.
Right, and now if we can just go on with another recent pick, and that's Ben Carson for Housing and Urban Development, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Now, Ben Carson comes across as a very nice fellow, and he might have been a superb surgeon. And he might even be the fellow you'd like to have as a next-door neighbor just to chat with hanging over the fence in between mowing the lawn. I have nothing against him as a personality, but it is clear that he has no sense of the real issues involving housing and urban development. And what are the problems? That the government is involved in it. Again, the only solution to this is to abolish the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Why is there housing crises? Why are there blighted areas in various cities or parts of cities around the country? Why is housing unaffordable? Why is housing straitjacketed to be available in some areas and not in others? It is all due to the heavy hand and intrusive hand of some level of government, whether it's the federal government or often the state and local governments. Zoning laws that politically determine how communities should evolve and develop and be integrated in terms of work, shopping, and living. Government subsidies of federal and state money to build these centralized public housing complexes that have been going on since certainly in the 1930s, but accelerating in the 50s and especially the 60s and 70s, that have created these little pens, if you will, of hostage pens of those who are on welfare or other forms of government assistance who are given this public housing, which is run down, crime-infested, unsafe, and during certainly the night, but during the day, in which people are just huddled together, cattled together, due to their status as welfare wards of the state and related positions. If we want to eliminate the housing problem, if we want to create vibrant urban as well as rural communities, if we want to give people greater opportunity and selection as to where they live, how they live, and at what price ranges, there is no solution and answer to this other than to abolish the Department of Housing and Urban Development and turn it over to those who are most attuned and aware of where people want to live and what they want to live in and what they can afford. And that is the consumers themselves and the home builders and contractors who have only one way of gaining revenue in a marketplace, and that is delivering the housing goods that people desire.
Yeah, your point about Carson is interesting. Yeah, but the guy's smart. I mean, why is he being selected, Director of Housing and Urban Development? Well, because he was one of the first opponents, or maybe the only opponent of Donald Trump, to come out and enthusiastically endorse him as soon as he dropped out of the race. So the guy's smart from a political stance, and that's the only reason he's being appointed Director of HUD. He certainly has no qualifications for it. You'd think he'd be appointed Surgeon General or something.
Yes.
But here's a guy's a doctor, and he's being put in charge of housing and urban development. What qualifications does he have? The guy's a doctor. But
correct.
But what business does the federal government have in housing and urban development? This is just classic social engineering. There's certainly no constitutional authority for it. And as you point out, these public housing projects are just bastions of drug dealing, corruption, despair, hopelessness. And notice something important here, Richard, and I noticed this when I lived back in Laredo, is that if they really wanted to help the poor with housing, and I'm not advocating this, but if they really wanted to help them with housing, the logical thing would be to build a house and just give it to them, deed it to them, so that they own the house now. They would learn to take care of it. They're going to be, reselling it. It becomes an investment in a way. They don't do that, the federal government. Instead, they rent to people, and then they tell them, if you make too much money, we're going to kick you out. So it becomes this lifelong generational after generation syndrome where people are stuck in public housing because they can't accumulate the necessary nest egg unless they cheat and lie to save enough money to go out and put a down payment on a house, because if they make too much money, they're kicked out. So you have generation after generation of people that are trapped in this thing. And there's also the social engineering that I saw in Laredo. I grew up, when I got back to Laredo after practicing law, I lived in a nice little middle-class area that was composed of people who had grown up in very poor families. My next door neighbor, for example, he had grown up in public housing. And it was one of the first middle class developments where the baby boomers were buying houses. HUD comes in and says, we need to do a public housing project right in the middle of this development. And I led the protest against it, and they were saying, oh, well, you hate the poor and the needy and the standard racist arguments. Well, I mean, here, the people that were in these middle-class homes were the poor. Their parents were still poor. Their parents were proud that their kids had gone to college and bought these houses, and all of a sudden they throw this this public housing project, because we lost the fight. They throw this public housing project in the middle of this nice little subdivision, and you know, of course, what that does to property values. And it diminishes the sense of, hey, if you work hard, if you accomplish something, you can go out and buy yourself a nice little home. Instead, they throw this bastion of you know, really not a nice way to live in the middle of this nice middle-class housing project. Yeah, I agree with you, Richard. The best thing to do is just abolish this thing. Let me wrap it up by saying you couldn't find a more crooked, corrupt department in U.S. history than HUD.
Yes. And then before our time gets too limited,
well, you know, we might be able to do more cabinets in a future show. So, you know, feel free to.
But I'll just mention one other, which is a crucial one, and that is this candidate Mnuchin for the Secretary of the Treasury. Trump ran on this idea that he was an outsider, that he wasn't beholden to anyone, that he was going to, you know, drain the swamp, that he was going to rattle the cage and change how Washington does its business with a whole variety of special interests. But the fact is that if you look at some of the people who he's tagged, including his nominee for the Secretary of the Treasury, all of these people are connected with these Wall Street banks, especially Goldman Sachs, which typify the crony capitalist system. We're not talking about a private commercial bank or a private commercial banking system where people are guided by competitive market forces, where the state merely enforces property rights and sees the contracts are obeyed. We're talking about a major bank that for decades has worked hand in glove with government and through government and benefiting from government. And once again, these same people who through this revolving door go from financial market to the government, from the financial market to the government, and then back and forth, that all of these people are now just being sucked in here. And don't be surprised if you see no difference in how the Department of the Treasury is run, the fiscal and financing decisions that the U.S. government makes, and who makes a pot of money over in Wall Street from dealing in government debt and securities. It'll all be the same insider banks with Goldman Sachs at the center, because Trump basically is just continuing the game as it's been going on.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got this corporatism and this combination of corporations in the state, the banking in the state, that turns into this crony capitalism, as you term it. I mean, it's the classic case where government is doing things that it shouldn't be doing, and that's, in this instance, combining with the private sector, the corporations, the big banks, to benefit their own little buddies. And you see this in the military-industrial complex, where where people are moving from the government to the so-called private sector. You see it same thing in banking industry and the corporate industry. I mean, it really goes to show you, Richard, how important we libertarians are at this point, because there's going to be no draining of the swamp. We know that. This is just going to be a change of people who are going to be benefiting from the largesse. It's all that this is about. And this is where libertarians are more important than ever, because we're going to see many more of our liberties taken away from us in this era of economic fascism. We get a glimpse of it in this Carrier decision, where Trump has intervened and Pence have intervened personally to resolve this issue. I mean, this is economic fascism, economic dictatorship. This is totally contrary to the principles of the rule of law. And we're going to see more and more of this. And this is what we've been saying. We libertarians have been saying for more than a year now, that this is what we're going to get with Donald Trump, this economic dictatorial type of conduct. And when you combine the power of the corporations, the banks, and the military-industrial complex, this does not bode well for the American people and for freedom.
No, and you see, and this example of the carrier manufacturer in Indiana brings in all these different strands that you just said. Now, a carrier makes a product that just seems to be a private sector product. And supposedly they've been offered $7 million of state-backed subsidies to stay in Indiana to save this approximately 1,000 jobs. But behind this, and Trump calling not just the head of Carrier, but the mother company, United Technologies, shows the fact that it's like the mafia boss who doesn't order directly that some guy be killed. They say, if Joe the Knife wasn't around anymore, my life would be so much nicer. And suddenly Joe the Knife disappears. But the mafia boss never gave the order itself. He just said how nice your life would be. Now, what does Trump do? He doesn't threaten to cut off other sources of government revenue for United Technologies. But I'm sure that he or someone on his transition team reminded the people at United Technologies that among other sources of revenue, they have contracts equal to $5.3 billion of federal military hardware sales. Now, suddenly, hey, I love doing business with you, particularly for this military hardware stuff. But, it would be so nice if we had these jobs staying in Indiana. I mean, it's the same thing as the mafia boss. And has Trump tried to do anything illegal in the sense of inappropriateness of promising government contracts outside of the usual procedures? Of course not. But everybody knows that hanging over them is the sword of Damocles that unless you go along with what now the president-elect wants and the new direction of what's going to be his version of government-business partnerships, that you might end up at the bottom of the line of the government trough rather than at the front.
Richard, it's clear that you have become the exact opposite of the public school success story.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
On that note, we're out of time, but I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to discuss the other cabinet positions. Pleasure to visit with you, Richard, and I'll see you next week.
Next time. Bye-bye.